Welcome back. This is Lecture 21, and it's about some troubles Darwin's theory encountered. Last time we saw how Darwin's book, The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, quickly sold out when it appeared in November of 1859. It had been long in the making. You could say Darwin had been working on it for some 2 decades. And even then, he'd been rushed into print when it looked like he might be scooped by someone else, Alfred Wallace. To top it off, it seemed to Darwin as if the idea of natural selection had just popped into Wallace's head in 1858. Anyway, when Darwin did get the book out, it quickly became the talk of the town. That was because Darwin was pretty well known in England. He was a respected naturalist and a world traveler. He was the author of numerous books on various aspects of the world of living things. He was an upstanding member of Victorian society, a well-to-do gentleman of natural science from a recognized lineage. The Darwins, like the Wedgwoods from his wife's side, were both widely known. Beyond the Darwins' acknowledged place in upper-middle-class society, Darwin's grandfather was a noted author of essay and verse. And the Wedgwoods? They were highly successful makers of pottery, including the Queensware style that was in such great demand. So the Wedgwoods were another easily recognized family. Yes, Darwin was somebody in English society. And here he was writing outlandish things, or were they outlandish? People were eager to learn exactly what Darwin had to say about the question raised by his title, How Species Originated. I referred last time to the charged atmosphere of the 1840s and 1850s because of the attention natural science was receiving from Chambers' book and other events. Those developments, however, weren't the only reason why the atmosphere was already heated up when Darwin came along. In fact, they weren't even the primary contributors to the tension. To see the whole picture, we have to look at the political climate. You see, there'd been a series of political revolutions in 1848. Not in England, mind you. They'd been confined to the continent. But there they'd occurred in several national capitals, Paris, of course, and Berlin and Vienna. In England, massive petitions demanding change had been submitted to Parliament, including a final one in 1848 itself, but things had not boiled over into genuine revolution in England like they had across the Channel. And the revolutions that occurred in the European capitals all had failed. Some took longer to play out than others, but by 1852, everything was over. And the monarchs were back on their thrones, seemingly more powerful than ever. What the revolutions had done, however, was to raise the hope, however briefly, that a new social order was dawning, one more in sync with the modern industrial era that was all around. Now, I bring up politics here because, especially on the continent, there were those who openly associated natural science with revolutions. We'll learn more about how this worked out later in Lecture 31. To be sure, they were the radical voices. The majority regarded natural science as a perfectly safe and respectable enterprise, not at all threatening to society. The point is, however, that just as natural science had begun to challenge cultural assumptions, it was now beginning to be used to challenge even political institutions. Among those who identified themselves with natural science, it seemed that an increasing number were happy to be associated with non-traditional positions. And that meant you could never be sure what position one of these new scientists was going to take. It could be, and most often was, a view that natural science reinforced all those good social values the Victorians were famous for. But not in every case. Society was changing on so many fronts. The new developments in natural science were just a small part of the general awareness that the world was changing fast. And another thing, for some time in the German states, the public had been greeted with works that were highly critical of traditional religion. David Friedrich Strauss had written a notorious life of Jesus that discarded miraculous events of the New Testament in the Bible as mere stories. And then another German, Ludwig Feuerbach, followed Strauss's work with a biting criticism of Christianity. Christian doctrine, Feuerbach wrote, was a mere projection of human needs into the heavens. Humans need love, so they create an all-loving God. Humans crave power, so God is all-powerful. Now, both of these works, that by Strauss and the one by Feuerbach, found their way into English translation, done by a young woman named Marianne Evans. So the fact there was a British market for this kind of thing meant that even in England, the stakes were going up on many fronts. As I said, we'll look into the impact of all this in a later lecture. For right now, I just want to note that the situation in 1859 had become more tense even from what it had been when Chambers' book had come out in 1844. Then the majority of people complained about Chambers, and they did so quite publicly. But by 1859, when Darwin's book was published, we're on the other side of revolutions on the continent and the radical German theology that had made its way into the country. Because there were more options out there, because you couldn't be sure anymore about who took these radical ideas seriously, it was no longer fashionable to make dogmatic public pronouncements about such controversial matters. In this lecture, we're going to see how Darwin's theory fared in the 19th century, and we're going to take into account all 4 decades that were left in the century. I say that because we're not going to rely solely on one of the initial reactions that has gotten so much press. You may have already heard about the famous encounter I have in mind. It happened in June of 1860, and it's been frequently misinterpreted. I'm referring to a meeting of the British Association in Oxford and the debate that took place there between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley. Here's what happened there. This was a meeting of Britain's first modern scientific society. What do I mean by modern? Well, I'm going to go into that in considerable detail in Lecture 28 when we talk about the new institutions of natural science that emerged in the 19th century. Suffice it here to say that by modern, I mean a society that was open to all natural scientists. And yes, by this time we do have scientists. They could come together in an annual meeting to exchange ideas. I know you've heard me insist before that we can't use the word scientist until it had been coined. Well, that had happened well before 1860. And in that year, the British Association was well over 20 years old. Its annual meeting had become a routine that everyone knew. On this particular day in June, something out of the ordinary occurred in a regular meeting titled simply Botany and Zoology. First, an American professor, John William Draper, he'd been trained in chemistry, was on the medical faculty at New York University. Draper spoke on the implications the Darwinian hypothesis held for civilization. He'd been working on a book on the intellectual history of Europe. It would appear in 1862, and he obviously wanted to incorporate into his thinking the latest developments in English science. But he was boring, and the audience began to let him know it. They were eager to hear what another person on the platform had to say about the Darwinian hypothesis. This was Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, who was present since the meeting of the British Association was in his city that year. What did he think of Darwin's book? As expected, the bishop, when he finally got to speak, was critical of Darwin's idea. He was a gifted orator, and the audience found him much more interesting than the American. On the platform as well was one of Darwin's defenders. We met him for the first time at that April meeting at Darwin's house back in 1856, when Darwin solicited opinions on the possibility that species might have evolved. This was Thomas Huxley, a young marine biologist. He'd objected to the idea of transmutation, or evolution, back in 1856, because he worried that it could be used to support the presumption that nature confirmed progress. Huxley thought that sounded too religious. But once Darwin's theory was published in full and Huxley read it, he was immediately convinced. His old worry about transmutation being too obviously progressive didn't apply to Darwin's version of evolution. Natural selection didn't guarantee progress in any traditional sense at all. So Huxley became one of Darwin's staunch defenders. He hadn't planned on going to the meeting that day to hear a clergyman rail against Darwin, but Robert Chambers persuaded him he ought to be there. Well, Wilberforce knew Huxley would be disagreeing with his criticisms of Darwin's theory, so he offered a challenge to Huxley. He inquired whether it was from his grandfather's or his grandmother's side that he was descended from an ape. Naturally, Huxley replied to Wilberforce in kind, in that bitingly critical way, wrapped in humor that the British do so well. And then others spoke to the session. The captain of the Beagle added his views, and Darwin's friend Joseph Hooker spoke up in defense of the theory. All in all, it was a prolonged exchange with a few charged statements thrown in for spice. It had been a debate, to be sure. There were partisans on both sides, but many of those present agreed that it had been a draw. If it had been unusual, it was because there had been some dogmatic claims made, and that, as I indicated, was no longer as fashionable as it had been when people had freely denounced Chambers's book. It's said that one woman fainted during the exchanges. And William Whewell, the highly respected master of Trinity College in Cambridge, thought that the bishop shouldn't have inserted himself into a debate about natural science. And Whewell was sympathetic to the bishop's point of view. In fact, however, the debate was a minor incident, and its significance has been overblown. I'll concede that it did focus public attention on Darwin and his book, but too often accounts of the 1860 meeting of the British Association have suggested that this was a high-water marker of the so-called warfare between science and religion. Of course, it did represent the exchange of ideas on this front. That had been going on since the Vestiges. But the charged atmosphere of the late 1850s was, as I indicated a minute ago, due to a lot of things. We have to make a distinction between the increasing presence of radical ideas and prevailing opinions. Yes, radical ideas were out there, and radicals were offensive because they disregarded the fashion of not openly proclaiming dogmatic views. Most folks were not for revolution. Most folks were not for the new German ideas about religion. Most folks were not persuaded that the newest ideas of natural science required them to change their views on religion. So there were more radical voices, but they didn't represent the prevailing opinion. I have to tell you that the relationship between natural science and religion was not, in fact, the most pressing issue of the day in Britain. It was not even the most pressing religious issue. British theologians were more concerned about the radical scholarship that was coming across the channel from Germany, what's known as the higher criticism of the Bible. In a controversial book of 1860 called Essays and Reviews, a collection of contributions from British scholars from several fields, higher criticism was the issue. Darwin's theory was barely mentioned. So my concern is that we put the 1860 British Association meeting in perspective. Ironically, the event has become significant, but I think its significance is not because of what happened there, but because of the way it has often been interpreted. Some historians who believe that religion and natural science are in fact mutually antagonistic have assumed that this was also true in 1860 in Britain. So they've portrayed the encounter as Huxley's triumph over Wilberforce. But it's the consensus now among historians that Darwin's book did not enter Victorian society like a plow running into an anthill. That's the colorful way one historian has characterized the misguided way some other historians have portrayed this incident. The more we learn about the 19th century in Britain, the more we have to acknowledge that numerous individuals, both scientists and theologians, reconciled Darwin's ideas to their conservative religious views. So we want to avoid bringing back to the 19th century ideas that are widely prevalent in our own day and assume they fit. I believe that in this case, they don't. Well, it wasn't long before scientific difficulties with Darwin's theory began to crop up. This happened right away in the 1860s. And I do mean scientific difficulties, issues raised not by the likes of Bishop Wilberforce, but by natural scientists themselves. Among the first was the claim that there hadn't been sufficient time for evolution by natural selection to occur. And it was raised from a quarter you might not expect, by a physicist. This was William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin. You may have heard of his absolute temperature scale. He was one of those who defined the new science of thermodynamics just prior to the appearance of the origin. Anyway, Thomson had become convinced that the cosmos was running down. What did he mean by running down? Well, we're going to take this up in earnest in lectures 29 and 30. For now, let me just say that Thomson inferred the running down of the cosmos from his work on energy exchanges. He determined that exchanging energy involved processes that were irreversible. One way of expressing this irreversibility was that gradually energy was becoming less available to sustain the order in the cosmos, so it was gradually running down. That meant, of course, that as time passed, the cosmos and the Earth within it was slowly becoming a different place. Now, you may recall that this was the opposite conclusion from the one that Charles Lyell believed. We met his steady-state Earth back in lecture 18. Lyell believed that the Earth had always been the same, essentially. Yes, it underwent cyclic changes. One region that was now dry land may have been underwater at an earlier time, but other than these minor changes, the landscape remained similar. The minor changes had no accumulative effect. If you were transported back in time, you'd recognize the landscape regardless of how long ago it was. So the Earth was in a steady state. Although it had been here for an enormous time, according to Lyell, it hadn't developed from some qualitatively different primitive condition to the one we see today. So Lyell and Thomson held opposite beliefs on the history of the Earth, and they were pretty much mutually exclusive. There really was no compromise possible. If Lyell were right, then the Earth could have been supporting life on its surface for who knows how long. Certainly more than enough time for the evolution Darwin claimed to have happened, and that was indeed a lot of time. If evolution happened as Darwin said it did, not according to some pre-existing plan, then it must have taken eons for the complexity we see to have come about. A little like, though admittedly not exactly like, the amount of time it would take monkeys to type Shakespeare. Thomson didn't think the Earth had been cool enough to support life for anywhere near that long. In fact, as early as 1861, Thomson announced to the British Association meeting that even the sun's age was likely no more than 100 million years old. And then a year later, Thomson declared that Lyell's steady-state theory of the Earth amounted to a perpetual motion machine. That, as many conceded, was against the first principles of natural philosophy. Well, Darwin's insistence on gradual evolutionary change required far more than even 100 million years. Physics and evolutionary biology were at odds. Some of Darwin's defenders tried to accommodate the physicists by suggesting that evolution might have occurred more rapidly than Darwin thought. But Darwin himself refused that suggestion. So Thomson's denial that there'd been sufficient time for gradual evolution to have happened remained a thorn in his side. It was only after the turn of the century, with the discovery of radioactivity, that physicists revised their estimates of the ages of the sun and Earth so that they were compatible with the kind of time scale that Darwinian evolution required. But it was an unresolved issue in the 19th century, certainly not something that helped Darwin's cause among scientists. That was one of the scientific difficulties, but there were more. A review of Darwin's book in 1867 by a Scottish engineer named Fleming Jenkin raised a pressing problem about why natural selection simply wouldn't work. Jenkin pointed out that the advantageous variations Darwin counted on so heavily wouldn't have the effect Darwin thought. They would, he said, be swamped out by normal traits. Let me explain. Here's how Jenkin thought of it. He appealed, in fact, to Victorian racial assumptions, racist assumptions, really, to illustrate his claim. Imagine, he said, that a white-skinned sailor is shipwrecked on an island inhabited only by blacks, Africa. Now remember, Jenkins equated the sailor's whiteness with superior traits of intelligence, ingenuity, courage, self-control, endurance. So where Jenkins was concerned, this sailor represented a favorable variation within the black population. He said, for example, that the white sailor would likely become king and have many wives and children. But as superior as this white man was supposed to be, it wouldn't matter. The black color of the general population and the lesser qualities of the natives would not be altered over time by his presence. Come back in a few generations, Jenkins said, and you likely wouldn't see any trace of the white man's presence. Why? Because it would have been washed completely away. You see, many in Darwin's day accepted the idea that heredity resulted from a blending of the traits of the parents. Blending inheritance was the idea that hereditary materials from two parents are on the whole averaged in the offspring. So as the sparse amount of white hereditary material was blended with the huge amount of black hereditary material, the white would be washed out. Even though it represented a favorable variation within the black community, it would simply be overwhelmed by the huge volume of the black characteristics present. Well, as long as you accepted the notion of blending inheritance, the idea that hereditary material of the parents is blended or averaged in sexual reproduction, as long as you accepted this, Jenkins' critique made a great deal of sense. If every generation averaged the hereditary material from the two parents, then since there was only one white in the population, the white hereditary material would be cut in half in the first generation of offspring, and thereafter it would continue to be cut in half with each succeeding generation. It wouldn't take that many generations before the white hereditary material would be just a trace amount. Darwin tried to respond by means of a theory of heredity he'd created that permitted some favorable variations to persevere, but he continued to smart under Jenkins' critique. Then came another criticism. The Duke of Argyll emphasized an instance of inheritance that seemed to escape natural selection. He wrote a book in 1867 called The Reign of Law, in which he argued that some natural traits were not governed by natural selection. Take the coloration in hummingbirds, he said. That didn't help them survive. And natural selection operated only on characteristics that benefited survival. So the Duke inferred that there must be a different source for nature's beauty than natural selection. And he could think of only one, the design of the Creator. God was the source of beauty since it wasn't required by nature. Darwin responded, of course. He appealed to a special application of natural selection. It's not true, he said, that nature doesn't need to have beauty. Beauty has a very practical function. Color, for example, is important in attracting mates. The greater the color, the more a hummingbird will mate. And the more it mates, the more it propagates its hereditary material among the species. A lot more, for example, than other less colored birds. Darwin's addition of sexual selection to his theory answered the Duke of Argyll, but I confess it didn't persuade the Duke, and it didn't persuade a lot of others. Enough of the scientific problems that Darwin's theory faced. There were also philosophical and religious difficulties with natural selection that made their appearance. Some people found Darwin's method objectionable. Many, including some of Darwin's friends, just couldn't accept the idea that natural selection operated on variations that were produced by chance. It seemed too preposterous. Are we really supposed to believe that the marvelous adaptations we see all around us in nature could result from chance? Some of these adaptations are truly amazing. They couldn't have come about as the result of chance variations. And if humans were also the product of this chance, then did the mental world of humans evolve from some kind of primitive condition too? If that were the case, then what about the moral capacity of humankind? If it ultimately derived from chance variations, if all we're doing is just trying to survive, then could you really say that we have any moral responsibility? But for most, the idea that morality was a survival mechanism was just too much. So natural selection didn't fare very well in the 19th century. But, and this is interesting, the general acceptance of the idea of evolution increased. I mean the idea that life had developed from some kind of primitive beginnings to what it is today. That gained credibility in the 19th century. Darwin's ironic achievement in the 19th century was to have promoted the notion of evolution at the expense of his own theory of natural selection. Once the origin made its appearance, there was a market for all kinds of books on evolution, and several people who had already believed in evolution now felt emboldened to come forward. Of course, there was a revised edition of the Vestiges that came out immediately, and it sold extremely well. And then an old school acquaintance of Darwin's from his days in Edinburgh published a synopsis of his zoology lectures that indicated his long-standing commitment to the evolution of life. Finally, a man named Herbert Spencer, we'll meet him again when we talk about social Darwinism. Spencer refined articles he'd written earlier on what he'd called the development hypothesis and put them out in a book called First Principles. It appeared in two parts in 1860 and 1862. Spencer's work depicted a grand cosmological evolution from a state of chaos to a state of order. If there ever was a work that underscored Britain's sense of progressive advance, this was it. But remember that Huxley had warned much earlier about the idea of progressive evolution. He thought it was something you had to be careful with. It could so easily be made into a general endorsement of progress that it forced nature to endorse progress. In fact, what appeared to be happening was that evolution was becoming a fashionable means of confirming progress. It was almost as if the approach Chambers had taken, and even the tact Lamarck had introduced, was becoming more acceptable. Add to it that Darwin himself had acknowledged that natural selection was not the exclusive means by which evolution occurred. His hereditary theory, for example, contained aspects that bore similarities to Lamarck, and he'd acknowledged in his book, The Origin of Species, that use and disuse did play a role in evolution, although in his view a much less prominent one than the role natural selection played. No wonder that the public often blurred the distinction between Darwin's and Lamarck's understanding of evolution. That was as annoying to Darwin as it was difficult for him to prevent. So what we can call neo-Lamarckian ideas flourished in the waning decades of the 19th century. The attraction of Lamarckian evolution was, as we saw in Lecture 16, that it could be easily reconciled with divinely controlled evolution. That might still be too much of a stretch for many, but Lamarckian deism was clearly becoming more acceptable. Natural selection, on the other hand, operated on variations that appeared as if out of nowhere. That is, you really didn't have to ask where they'd come from. Darwin's theory worked just fine, even if you assumed they were completely random. As a result, you couldn't predict in advance where Darwin's evolution was going, and that made natural selection incompatible with Victorian convictions about progress and advance. So when I note that the idea of evolution became more and more popular as the century wound down, invariably it was some form of neo-Lamarckian evolution that filled this bill. It led, by the end of the century, to what one historian has called the eclipse of Darwinism. An eclipse of the moon involves a part of the moon being blocked out for a time. And that's what happened to Darwin's natural selection. It got partially blocked out during the waning decades of the century. While the idea of evolution found greater acceptance, natural selection as the means by which it occurred did not. So the eclipse of Darwinism has come to refer to the preference for neo-Lamarckian ideas of evolution over Darwin's natural selection in the decades around 1900. As you can guess, Darwin's understanding of evolution by natural selection did come out from behind the moon, so to speak. But how Darwinism, that is evolution by natural selection, emerged into prominence again is a story for historians of 20th century science to tell. Now, back in Lecture 7, when we were talking about Linnaeus and his insight that some species had come into existence after the original creation, that there had been an origin of species, I noted that this was a different claim from one about the origin of life itself. That issue, the origin of life from non-living nature, was hinted at and discussed in the early 19th century. We saw it in Lamarck, and it was also a subject taken up by the German Romantic nature philosophers. It became an issue again in these decades around the time of Darwin's work. Darwin himself avoided the claim that life had arisen naturalistically. He allowed that the Creator had breathed into life breathed life into an original form or forms. But others, particularly in France, did not avoid it, and it precipitated a real debate that involved one of France's favorite sons, Louis Pasteur. His contribution to the debate about the origin of life has to be viewed in the context of Pasteur's overall achievement as a man of science. That's what we'll take up in the next lecture.